friends. Welcome to another installment of Experiments in Thought. We're glad that you've decided to join us on our never-ending quest for knowledge and truth as we journey through space, time, and the minds.
Today we'd like to talk to you about the current state of affairs in this country regarding certain facets of society.
We believe the political paradigm we are so familiar with, the choice between Democrat and Republican parties, is nothing more than a system of misdirection. They aren't two diametrically opposed factions. They both play for the same team.
Isn't it plain to see the divide and conquer strategy being utilized on the people of this country? It's a manipulation tool that's been used to control populations since the dawn of civilization. Split the nation into two opposing ideologies and let them argue, fight, sabotage, and lambaste the other side. The people who are actually in control of the country can sit back and watch this left versus right clash play out. They know it's like when an irresistible force meets an immovable object. It's a gridlock and nothing changes or progresses.
The sad part is that we, the people, are dumb enough to buy into this trickery. The general public is always whipped up into a fervor, and they make decisions based on the manipulation of their emotions. For example, this is how an average person can actually be led to believe that war is a good idea. Play on their emotions with red, white, and blue TV ads, patriotic music, yellow ribbons, a gratuitous image of the flag at Iwo Jima, and a heartfelt speech from a respected leader. It's a massive cheerleading operation, and it's amazing how effective it is. But this strategy is no different from the propaganda that Joseph Goebbels used to indoctrinate an entire populace into a cult of nationalism, hatred, and murder. It's always a slippery slope when you allow other people to do your thinking for you, especially when those people are in positions of power.
Both Democrats and Republicans spend money into oblivion and allocate tax dollars in sinister ways. Our federal tax code has become so littered with loopholes and shrouded in ambiguity that many of the largest corporations in the U.S. have managed to discover a way to pay their top executive millions and millions of dollars in bonuses and still not pay a single dime of income taxes to our government. The budget that the Obama administration has submitted for the fiscal 2012 year assumes that the U.S. government will bring in about $2.1 trillion in income this year, mostly by taxing all of us. And by 2021, Obama's current budget scheme assumes that the U.S. government will be able to increase that figure to $4.9 trillion. Can someone please tell me how in the world the U.S. government is going to get over twice as much tax money out of all of us 10 years from now?
A lot can be learned if we look at the campaign funding for prominent politicians. The people and corporations who fund the lavishly expensive campaigns are effectively the arbiters who grant the politicians their seat of power. Does common sense allow us to believe that once elected, the politicians don't return the favor in some way? Do the entities that contribute millions of dollars to these politicians cease to hold sway over the actions in office? We might then ask, what purpose did these entities have for contributing such massive sums of money to the politicians in the first place? Did they honestly not expect a certain quid pro quo?
Just between the campaigns of Obama and Romney this last election, over $1 billion were spent. $1 billion. If we had a truly free-thinking society, campaigns could be operated for a fraction of a fraction of a fraction of that amount. Think about all the other causes that the campaign money could have been used for. The same entities that fund both the Democrats and Republicans. For an example, Goldman Sachs Bank was Obama's second largest campaign contributor in 2008. Then last year, it became Romney's top campaign contributor.
This is common. All of the largest defense contractors, including Grumman, Lockheed, and Boeing, split their campaign donations almost evenly between Obama and Romney. The same can be said for the major pharmaceutical companies. If we follow the breadcrumbs far enough, we'll find that the government is controlled by a cartel of corporations and international banks that are made up of dynasties of elitist families and social classes. Both parties are funded, bought, and paid for by the military-industrial complex and associated commercial interests.
If we continue to dig deeper into the corruption and conspiracy, it gets a lot more disconcerting than just manipulation of tax money and broken budgets. Let's review some of the history of American politics in the latter 20th century. President Eisenhower warned in his farewell address in January 1961 of the growing military-industrial complex. This warning proved to be prophetic, as less than 3 years later his successor was killed for coming into conflict with those who stood to benefit from the war-making industry, primarily in Vietnam.
Billions of taxpayers' dollars were illegally funneled into clandestine operations in Vietnam since the end of World War II, carefully manufacturing a situation that would eventually erupt into war. The corporations and backers of building war materials were to profit in the tens of millions of dollars each year, as long as there was American involvement in Southeast Asia. This is the true reason for the Vietnam War. There was no communist threat to American interests or security that necessitated our intervention there. Conversely, the war was created by the CIA and other veiled elements of the American government out of thin air in order to advance the military-industrial complex.
Kennedy was against exacerbating American involvement in Vietnam and took action to change this course of events. He vowed to shatter the CIA into 1,000 pieces. The obscure power elite could not allow Kennedy to prevent them from enormous profits and continued exertion of influence over international policies, so they had him killed. Of course, 4 days after the assassination, new President Lyndon Johnson reversed the Kennedy policy on war in Vietnam, and instead of all Americans being out by 1965, the war developed as planned by the CIA and power elite and generated billions of dollars for the war machine and cost almost 60,000 American lives and millions of Vietnamese lives.
Some shocking and interesting examples of corruption include the CIA's Project MK-Ultra during the 50s and 60s, which was meant to investigate possible forms of mind control and included multiple methods of torture and the use of highly potent LSD on unwitting subjects. There was a sub-project of MK-Ultra called Operation Midnight Climax. Under this program, prostitutes working for the CIA would lure their johns back to government-controlled brothels and administer extremely high doses of LSD to them as CIA officials observed through one-way glass windows.
Other shocking examples include the many false flag operations planned and carried out by the government in order to gain popular support for military action. The history of such activities is long and complex. There's the 1953 Iran coup, Operation Ajax, orchestrated by the CIA, which replaced the democratically elected government with a tyrant in order for American oil companies to take control in the region. And there's the infamous example of Operation Northwoods, drawn up by the Joint Chiefs of Staff but rejected by President Kennedy and never carried out. But it called for the bombing of an American plane and fake terror attacks on American citizens, which would then be blamed on the Cuban communists, paving the way for an all-out invasion of Cuba.
There was the Gulf of Tonkin incident, where a non-existent enemy attack on an American vessel allowed the government a viable pretext for the massive escalation of involvement in Vietnam. Events like this are very reminiscent of the Reichstag fire of 1933, are they not? And if you're interested in the subject, look into the American funding of rebels in Afghanistan during the Soviet invasion of the 70s and 80s. You might be surprised at certain names that pop up in the organizations that they later developed into, and the fact that their training and arms funding came from us.
We can look at recent examples to find political corruption utilizing the war machine. Remember Dick Cheney? Here's a man who was a driving force in making the Iraq conflict happen. He owned quite a bit of stock in his former company, Halliburton. Now, after Iraq was devastated by the war, guess who gets a massive government contract worth billions of dollars to come in and rebuild Iraq? Halliburton.
Cheney's personal stock in the company rose something like 3,000% over the first few years of the war. Is there a connection here? Think about it for yourself. There's also the case of the Blackwater private military contracts. Blackwater, as they used to be called, received around $700,000 in federal contracts in 2001. By 2005, with the two wars established in the Middle East, Blackwater's federal contracts had risen to over $200 million.
Think about those numbers for a second. By the way, the armed security company formerly known as Blackwater has recently merged with global genetically modified food giant Monsanto. Don't even get us started on that. And keep in mind, these are just a couple of small examples. There are inexhaustible amounts of similar cases throughout modern history that we simply don't have the time to get into here.
The great enemy of truth is very often not the lie, deliberate, contrived, and dishonest, but the myth, persistent, persuasive, and unrealistic. Too often we hold fast to the cliches of our forebears. We subject all facts to a prefabricated set of interpretations. We enjoy the comfort of opinion without the discomfort of thought. John F. Kennedy. With all the corruption in government and high-level circles of society, the fault for its perpetuation ultimately lies with us, the people, the sheep. Today, the access to information is so astounding, the only apathy among the public will allow the truth to remain hidden and business to carry on as usual.
This apathy, this disinterest in matters of history and philosophy, this reluctance to entertain thoughts about our place in the wider world, this objection to forming new perspectives, this steadfast aversion to changing our minds, it's the implicit consent we offer to the silent oppressors. Nowhere is this obstructionist disposition more extant than in, how to put this, redneck circles. There's a certain pride in ignorance that flourishes in some communities, usually corresponding with the general country ethos.
This outlook will often manifest in nationalistic political leanings and bitter sentiments towards people of different lifestyles. This demographic constitutes the main source of public support for wars and military interventions proposed by government leaders. Not coincidentally, this segment of society will often try to impede the progression of our education system as well. There is no easy solution for softening the rigidity of this collective mindset, nor is it an easy task to inspire new ideas to take hold in stubborn old haunts. It is entirely an issue for the individual.
Like most moral dilemmas or cases of social tension, it's up to each individual to think for themselves and not allow their surrounding influences to dictate their courses of action. The key here is to be open to progression. As Charles Darwin said, it is not the strongest of the species that survives, nor the most intelligent that survives. It is the one that is most adaptable to change.
On a related note, we find the whole uproar over gun rights and the Second Amendment to be particularly hilarious. The banter and rhetoric is comic opera. What about the Constitution's other amendments? You never hear a gun fanatic offer a perspective on those. Could it be that the Second Amendment is the only piece of the Constitution that they're familiar with? Maybe it would be a good idea to bone up on their post-revolutionary framer and founder history before commenting further. In any case, we support the right of each individual to own firearms, unhindered by Big Brother's intervention.
That being said, there's something unsettling about people who have a fetish for guns. What is a gun but a modern version of the caveman's club? It is the protector of the ego, a tool to mentally insulate oneself from the feeling of vulnerability. When someone who's afraid of looking inward fires a weapon, they get a rush, a feeling of power, of control. Like a monkey who has just splattered a handful of shit into their rival's face. But what power is this? Does this grant them control over life and death? Control over the winds and eruptions of the earth? Control over the hurling asteroids and swirling black holes? The only way to control these things is through inner peace and acceptance. When we can accept all truths as true and deny all of the lies that we have been conditioned to tell ourselves, we can truly become masters of the universe.
We believe the best method for fixing political corruption is for the youth to refuse to operate the same way when our generation takes the helm. People who are in their 20s right now have the best chance out of any generation in human history to be the generation that finally unshackles humanity from the primitive patterns we've been operating under for so long. When the current politicians, banksters, and bureaucrats relinquish control of this country, it's our time to change the way leaders lead.
We hope you enjoyed this conversation as much as we did. We encourage you to do your own research and come to your own conclusions. Don't take our word for any of it. Think for yourself.
History repeats itself.
History repeats itself. History repeats itself.
The past is prologue.
The future is up to you.